Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, we're continuing with session number 2 of our new series entitled Complex Medical Decision Making and the QME. And I have a fascinating program for you today, one which I'm certain will help you in the preparation of the very QME evaluation that you're currently working on. And in this program, we're tackling what qualified medical evaluators consider universally across all specialties up and down the entire state of California, what QMEs consider to be the most difficult issues upon which they are called upon to opine in the body of their QME reports. And I'm sure you know what those issues are, and those are the issues that we're going to tackle head on in this program. Now, in terms of a general philosophy of this program, I'm sure that you'll agree with me that a human being, and a qualified medical evaluator in particular, is a shortcut-seeking mechanism. Human beings and qualified medical evaluators especially seem to seek shortcuts whenever they stumble upon, speaking about qualified medical evaluators here, whenever qualified medical evaluators stumble upon a difficult medical decision-making choke point in their reports, they invariably, like all human beings do when faced with difficult issues, is to seek a shortcut solution to the problem. And let me just give you an example of this in my own experience and in my own life, because I am just like you, and I always have a tendency to seek shortcuts when the going gets tough. And so let me just give you a couple of examples from my own experience. Because this program is being recorded at the first of the year, I recently had a necessity to reorganize some patient files from my clinical practice. And what I was doing was I was pulling out of my stack of patient files those patient files that are inactive files. Inactive files. I'm sure that you've done this before in your own clinical practice. And when I had my stack of inactive files, my mind momentarily went through some shortcut-seeking mechanisms to decide what to do with this stack of inactive files. Now, ordinarily, I would take these inactive files and I would merge them with my lifetime and historic stack of inactive files, and I would organize them alphabetically. But when I looked at this stack of inactive files, my mind did a calculation, and I concluded that it would cost me about 45 minutes to go through the exhaustive process of alphabetizing this stack of inactive files. And my mind came up with all kinds of justifications as to why it would not be necessary to alphabetize these files. In other words, the probability of ever encountering or having to retrieve one of these inactive files from this stack of inactive files was remote to nil. Okay? And so my mind almost had myself convinced to just take this new stack of inactive files and just stack it on top of the prior stack, and just it would be fine. And that would be a shortcut, and it would save me 45 minutes. Well, as another example, I was recently doing some programming on my website, and I came upon a difficult issue that I didn't know how to do. It had to do with installing some HTML code in my website to allow users to the website and visitors to the website to obtain a specific function from the website. And no matter what I did, it was not working. And so, being a shortcut-seeking mechanism that I am, that you are, that we all are, I thought to myself, is this really necessary? Do I really need to invest the time, the effort, the energy involved with learning how to handle this HTML code? Do I really need to do that? What is going to be the cost-benefit ratio of actually going through the process to get this HTML code installed on my website compared to the time that it would cost me to do it? And I thought, I'll just omit it. I'll just delete it. I won't do it. I won't offer this particular service on my website that requires HTML code. But in both circumstances, I caught myself. And I had to do what I didn't want to do, but I had to do what was actually the correct thing to do. And that was, it was the correct thing to do to take the time and organize the files in alphabetic order. And it was the correct thing to do to take the time to make a phone call to technical support, to read an article that technical support sent me as to how to install this HTML code. And in both circumstances, both situations, upon where I arrived at a choke point that brought me to the limit of my capacity or the limit of my knowledge, or that brought me to the brink of my weak point, I started to squirm, and I started to look for a shortcut, and I started to look for a way out of having to confront the issue where I was weak. Well, as qualified medical evaluators, you're wondering, what does this have to do with me as a qualified medical evaluator? Qualified medical evaluators all do the same thing. When they stumble upon a choke point in a difficult decision-making area in their reports, they start squirming, and they look for ways out, and they look for shortcuts, and they look for ways to not address the issue that they're called upon to resolve. Unfortunately, you can fail to organize your inactive files in your clinical practice, or you can do whatever you want with your website in terms of omitting HTML code if you don't want to do that. But in the work that we do, the parties rely upon us to resolve difficult issues, and they rely on us to resolve difficult issues expeditiously so as to avoid delays in the system. And when qualified medical evaluators defer, delay, and look for shortcuts, they invariably introduce delays into the system. And this is both costly and unnecessary, and it causes the system to slow down and interferes with the handling of cases and the distribution of benefits to injured workers who need those benefits. And so I'm encouraging you through the principles in this program to quickly resolve disputed issues. And in this program, we're talking about the most difficult issues that face qualified medical evaluators, including the AOE COE determination, including the permanent impairment ratings that you provide for your examinee, and in determining your apportionment approximate percentages. And we're talking about how to handle these issues and how to quickly provide opinions and conclusions on these issues in a way that your opinions and conclusions qualify as substantial medical evidence and can be used by the parties in moving these cases forward. And in session 1 of this program, we started about how to handle the difficult determination of AOE COE in the specific scenario that involves the post-employment cumulative trauma claim for which the claims administrator has issued a denial or a delay in the case. Typically, these cases involve denied cases. So this specific scenario, which is commonly and frequently facing qualified medical evaluators, especially these days, this post-employment cumulative trauma claim, seems to be the most difficult AOE COE determination facing qualified medical evaluators. So we're talking in our last session, and we're going to continue today, as to how to handle the AOE COE determination for the post-employment cumulative trauma claim. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off in our last session. In our last session, we started talking about AOE COE and the determination either for or against industrial injury in the denied post-employment cumulative trauma claim. And we're handling the AOE COE determination in two separate sections. First is for you to begin to understand what happens behind the scenes and what gets your phone to ring for an appointment in the first place in these denied cases. So that's step one in our understanding as to how to handle the AOE COE determination. And then secondly, some important issues to consider both during and after the face-to-face evaluation that will help you in arriving at the correct determination every single time. So in our last session, we talked about what gets your phone to ring and how it is that denied cases come to you for a determination on AOE COE. And we talked about QME forms 105 and 106. We talked about Labor Code 5402, also known as the $10,000 rule. We talked about Labor Code 4060 and the compensability evaluation, which is the type of evaluation that you're being called upon to perform in these denied cases. Now, it's critical for you to understand these behind-the-scenes workings that cause your phone to ring for an evaluation. And this is where we left off in our last session. And today we want to pick up right here, and we want to continue with some more behind-the-scenes discussion and discover what it is that causes the claims administrator to deny the claim. So let me ask you, what factors, and this is what we're going to discuss today, what factors do you think would contribute to the claims adjuster denying the claim? Let me ask you, what types of claims get immediately accepted by the claims administrator, and what types of claims, in contrast to those, are the types of claims that get denied or disputed by the claims adjuster? Let me ask you, if an employee falls off a second-story roof onto his back in front of 3 coworkers and the owner of the company, and is transported immediately by ambulance to the local emergency department, is that the type of claim that the claims administrator is going to deny or put a disputed stamp on? No, that's the kind of case that the claims administrator is going to immediately accept. So what types of cases then, what types of claims would the claims administrator be tempted or compelled to deny? Let me ask you that. Well, the answer to that can only be it's the claims that have associated red flags associated with them that cause the claims administrator's eyebrow to be raised, causes the claims administrator to become suspicious that, as to the sincerity or the veracity of a bona fide claim, and causes the claims administrator to pull out the denied stamp and stamp the case as a denied case. So let's talk and let's explore this concept as to why and how it is that claims administrators come to deny these particular claims. And we're focusing in this program especially on the post-employment cumulative trauma species of claim. Okay, so let's go over our topics for discussion today. And remember that claims administrators don't deny obvious and bona fide cases for industrial injury. It's the cases that involve red flags that causes the claims administrator to get out the denial stamp. So let's talk about how it is that this process behind the scenes causes your phone to ring for a qualified medical evaluation. And today we're going to talk about 2 things that run through the mind of the claims administrator. Number 1 has to do with suspicions for fraud in these post-employment cumulative trauma claims, and it has to do with the burden of proof for establishing industrial injury. So we're going to review some important references in the AMA guides and in the 2017 RAND study, which dealt with post-employment cumulative trauma claims. And then after we understand these behind-the-scenes workings that cause your phone to ring for a QME evaluation, we're going to talk about how to proceed in the face-to-face evaluation and how to proceed in the production of your report to assess the examinee's credibility, and then also how to prepare your report and how to arrive at the correct AOE COE determination in every single case. Okay, so let's begin with understanding who carries the burden of proof for establishing industrial injury in the first place, and how it is that the claims payer, claims administrator, looks at the burden of proof in deciding whether to accept or to deny these post-employment cumulative trauma claims. Okay, so I want you to imagine this. I want you to imagine that you're a claims administrator working at a large workers' compensation insurance company here in the state of California, and on any given day you're receiving 10 to 20 new claims for industrial injury. Well, I'm sure you can imagine that you must have to develop, or there must be an established system for determining which are the cases that immediately become accepted cases and which of the cases are those cases that the claims administrator can comfortably deny, knowing that they've made the proper determination. Well, this has to do with the burden of proof for establishing industrial injury. And the law, and in this case it's actually 3 laws, Labor Code 3202.5, Labor Code 5705, and Labor Code 3600, clearly and squarely place the burden of proof for establishing industrial injury squarely upon the shoulders of the injured worker, the employee. The person claiming industrial injury has the burden of proof for establishing and proving industrial injury. So imagine that you're a claims administrator and you know that these 3 laws, place the burden of proof on the employee claiming industrial injury. What would you do if you were a claims administrator receiving 20 new claims per day? What would you do? What would be the key question that you would ask yourself in trying to decide whether to approve or to deny the case? The key question is, can the employee prove it? Can the employee prove it? The law, in fact, there's 3 laws that place the burden of proof on the injured employee. So the claims administrator simply asks themselves, can the employee prove it? Is there proof of an industrial injury? Can the employee prove it consistent with the law? And if the answer to that question is no, out comes the denied stamp. So let's quickly review these laws so that you understand where the burden of proof actually rests. So Labor Code 3205 says that all parties and lien claimants shall meet the evidentiary burden of proof on all issues such as the occurrence or non-occurrence of an industrial injury, and they shall meet this burden of proof by a preponderance of the evidence. A preponderance of the evidence, in order that all parties are considered equal before the law. Now, preponderance of evidence, what does that mean? That's a legal term. And for us as medical evaluators, what does that mean for us? What does this actually signify? It tells us that a preponderance of evidence means that evidence that when weighed with all the other evidence opposed to it has more convincing force and the greater probability of truth. More convincing force and the greater probability of truth. When weighing the evidence, the test is not the relative number of pieces of evidence or the relative number of witnesses or the relative number of documents, forms, claim forms, incident reports, witness statements. It's not based on the number of pieces of proof, but it's based on the relative convincing force of the evidence. So the claims administrator looks at the evidence that's presented by the party forwarding the issue, the injured employee forwarding the issue of an industrial injury. Claims administrator looks at the evidence, and in most cases, especially in these post-employment cumulative trauma cases, there's no evidence. There's absolutely no evidence. There's no claim forms, no incident reports, no history of medical treatment in any medical records. There's no evidence. And so there's no preponderance. There's no preponderance of evidence, and there's no evidence in support of a claim. So in a knee-jerk reflexive reaction, the claims administrator just brings out the denial stamp and denies the case. Okay, so that's Labor Code 3202.5. Okay, so what about Labor Code 5705? We already have one law established, 3202.5, that places the burden of proof for establishing industrial injury on the shoulders of the employee. Well, the second labor code, the second law, is Labor Code 5705, And 5705 reminds us that the burden of proof rests upon the party or the lien claimant holding the affirmative of the issue. And the affirmative of the issue is the party who's forwarding the issue. So in this case, and for our purposes, in the denied post-employment cumulative trauma claim, it's the injured employee who holds the affirmative, or who is claiming, or who is trying to establish an industrial injury. So the burden of proof rests upon the employee. Okay? So now we have two labor codes that place the burden of proof on the employee. Well, Labor Code 5705 gives us some examples to help illustrate this principle, and it tells us that the following are some affirmative defenses. These are statements or accusations or positions forwarded by the employer to defend against an industrial injury. So these are referred to as affirmative defenses. And like all other issues, the party forwarding the issue carries the burden, and it reminds us that the burden of proof rests upon, in this case, the employer to establish them. So let's just go through some of these to illustrate this principle and how the burden of proof is perceived within the workers' compensation system. So under Section A, an employer can defend against a claim for industrial injury by asserting that the employee was not an employee at all at the time of the injury, but rather was an independent contractor. And then the employer would be required to carry their burden of proof to prove this independent or non-employee status at the time of the industrial injury. The employer could claim that the employee was intoxicated at the time of his or her injury, and then of course would have to prove the intoxication, at which case the employer would have carried their burden. That the injury was caused by willful misconduct of the employee causing his or her injury, and the employer would be required to provide some proof. In the absence of proof, this affirmative defense would simply disappear without proof. Okay? That the injury or the aggravation of disability was caused by unreasonable conduct, or that the injured employee failed to give notice as required by sections 5400 and 5401. And we talked about those in our last session, but the point for today's session is that, again, we now have two laws that place the burden of proof directly on the shoulders of the person holding the affirmative of the issue. And in the case of a post-employment cumulative trauma claim, those shoulders are the shoulders of the employee claiming industrial injury. Okay, and then finally, Labor Code 3600, which deals with the specific species of claim that we're dealing with in today's discussion, the post-employment cumulative trauma claim. 3600 gives us the third labor code that places the burden of proof upon the party holding the affirmative of the issue, which in this case is the employee. So Labor Code 3600 specifically addresses this issue, and it tells us that for all injuries, the only exception being those claims for psychiatric injuries, but for all injuries where the claim for compensation is filed after notice of termination or layoff, these are the post-employment claims, including a voluntary layoff, and the claim is for an injury occurring prior to the time of notice of termination or layoff. In other words, the claim is for an injury during the period of time that the employee was working actively for the employer. It tells us no compensation shall be paid. No compensation shall be paid, and the claims administrator gets out the denial stamp and denies compensation unless, and Labor Code 3600 then gives us several exceptions to the no compensation clause or the no compensation requirement of this section of the law. It tells us that there are a few exceptions, but the employee must demonstrate by a preponderance of the evidence that one or more of the following exceptions exist. And we're not going to go into the exceptions, But again, the purpose of this is to drive home the point that the burden of proof rests with the party holding the affirmative of the issue. In this case, 3600 tells us that that's the employee. The employee must demonstrate by a preponderance of evidence, and that means the evidence must have some relative convincing force to convince the claims administrator that an industrial injury actually did occur. Okay, so the claims administrator takes a look at this evidence that's presented by the employee, and in the absence of any convincingly forceful evidence presented by the employee, claims administrator simply denies the case. Okay, and so you might ask yourself, when these cases come to you for a Labor Code 4060 compensability determination, you might ask yourself, what preponderance of evidence is the employee bringing? What is the preponderance of evidence? What is the evidence? Does it constitute a preponderance? Many times injured workers come to the face-to-face evaluation. The only evidence that they bring to the face-to-face evaluation is their testimony, is their subjective testimony as to how they suffered an industrial cumulative trauma injury way back when, when they were under the employ of ABC employer, and the claims administrator looks at that and realizes that there's no preponderance of evidence, and the employee fails to carry their burden, and the case comes to you for a compensability determination. So the claims administrator, number one, takes a look at the preponderance of evidence and the injured employees, the alleged injured employee's capacity to carry their burden. If the injured employee cannot carry the burden, then the claims administrator can comfortably deny the case. Well, in addition to that, claims administrators and the system in general is concerned for those cases that have red flags that could be suspicious for fraudulent claims. And fraudulent claims, as you can imagine, are widespread and rampant in workers' compensation, as they are in any other form of compensation claims, such as personal injury claims, Social Security disability claims, Veterans Administration disability claims. Okay, these so-called compensation claims have a measure of fraud associated with them, and workers' compensation is no different. So in order to understand some of the decision-making algorithms going through the mind of the claims administrator, let's talk about what the AMA guides, and let's talk about what the 2017 RAND study had to say about fraud in workers' compensation, and specifically about fraud in the post-employment cumulative trauma species of claim. Okay, so in the AMA guides have a section in chapter 18, which is the very last chapter in the book. And section 18.7 discusses malingering, is the very last section in the very last chapter of the entire AMA Guides book. It's almost as if the authors of the AMA Guides say to us in this particular section of the book, they say to us, hold on a minute. Now that we've spent 18 chapters teaching you how to provide for permanent impairment ratings for, in this case, injured workers in the state of California, now that you know that, there's just one little thing that we want to share with you before we release you to go out into the world of doing permanent impairment evaluations. And they tell us that you should be aware of the possibility or the potential for malingering in your examinee. So this comes in the very last section of the very last chapter of the book. And the guides tell us that malingering, and this is what claims administrators are concerned about in these post-employment cumulative trauma claims. They're concerned about fraudulent claims. So what do the guides have to say? They tell us that malingering is the conscious deception for the purpose of gain. So two key words here is that malingering is conscious, and that the employee or the malingerer has some expectation of gain. There has to be some gain. And now let me ask you, in the workers' compensation system, Are there benefits to gain? Of course there are. There are many rich and valuable benefits to be gained. And so gain is a key element already present in these workers' compensation claims that we deal with. Now, the guides tell us that most authorities declare that malingering is quite uncommon. There appear to be very few data regarding its frequency. And here the AMA guides cite at least 3 or 4 studies that talk about the frequency of malingering out in the medical setting, and specifically in regard to compensation claims. So let's go over the few data that is cited by the AMA guides, and I encourage each of you to read each one of these references. Each one of these are available as references in Chapter 18, and it's a good study for you to actually read these studies and learn about malingering in various different scenarios involved with compensation claims. So Fishbane claimed that malingering is present in a small percentage of cases, 1.25% to approximately 10% in those individuals with chronic pain. So let me ask you, are injured workers in the workers' compensation system, are they likely to complain of chronic pain? Chronic pain, isn't chronic pain the type of pain being claimed by an injured worker alleging a post-employment cumulative trauma type of claim? Aren't they claiming chronic pain? They're claiming chronic pain. So there's a certain percentage of those, according to Fishbane, that are going to be engaged in some degree of malingering. So then the AMA guides go on to discuss several other studies that describe the frequency of malingering in compensation claims. So let's review these studies one at a time. There's one study, I think it came out of Great Britain if I remember correctly, where they investigated individuals who came to the emergency department complaining of unexplained and difficult to deal with or hard to control, so-called intractable diarrhea. And they found that 14% of these people had positive stool examinations for laxatives, even though all of these people had denied laxatives. So imagine this. A person comes to the emergency department complaining of unexplained, I don't know, what's the cause of this diarrhea? Doctor says, what's the cause of your diarrhea? Are you lactose intolerant? Are you eating foods that you're allergic to? What's the cause of it? And the patient says, I don't know. And so the emergency department then goes through the investigation process to explore the cause of this diarrhea, running all kind of expensive and invasive procedures to ascertain what is the cause of the diarrhea and what needs to be done for the diarrhea, when all the while these patients are coming to the emergency department having knowingly taken laxatives to cause themselves diarrhea, even though they deny the use of laxatives upon direct questioning by the emergency department personnel. So you might ask yourself, well, why would a person do such a thing? And we don't know, and the study doesn't address that. We simply know that they do. And the AMA guides quote 14% malingering in this particular study. Another study had to deal with noise-induced hearing loss. These are people that work in loud environments, such as by freeways and by airports and what have you. And they studied 333 people who were claiming compensation. Okay, these are compensation claims. For noise-induced hearing loss, the incidence of exaggeration on hearing tests was a little bit higher. It was 17.7%. So these are people who are claiming to have loss of hearing. In other words, they would put the tone in the ear to do hearing tests, and the claimant would sit there mute. Nope, don't hear it, don't hear it. And a technician would administer a sound in the ear, and claimant would say, nope, don't hear it. When in all actuality, as determined by an objective test, okay? Bypassing the claimant's subjective response, no, I don't hear it, using an objective test such as cortical evoked response audiometry, they found that actually the tone was reaching the auditory cortex, and therefore the examinee must hear the tone because the entire neurologic pathway was completely intact. And they cite a malingering rate of 17.7%. Finally, Weintraub cited studies wherein he concluded that 20 to 46% of people, this is people like lay people like you and me, out there in the world, just walking around, people consider purposeful misrepresentation, in other words, lying, they consider this to be acceptable behavior as relates to compensation claims. They accept a certain amount of hyperbole when it comes to compensation claims. A little bit of exaggeration, a little bit of malingering, a little bit of untruthfulness. It's okay. It's okay in compensation claims. And Weintraub sets that 1 in 5 people to as many as almost 1 in 2, right? 46% is almost 1 in 2. This is almost 50%. That's every other person considers a little bit of exaggeration, a little bit of malingering to be acceptable behavior in compensation claims. And guess what? The claims administrators, they know this. They know this because they deal with these claims, hundreds and hundreds of claims on a monthly basis, and they simply have to have a system for handling these claims. And considering that as many as 50% of people may be inclined to malinger and to file fraudulent claims, coupled with the burden of proof for establishing industrial injury, makes it very easy for the claims administrator to simply deny the claim. Now, for you and our purposes as qualified medical evaluators, we also need to consider the possibility of malingering or exaggeration or purposeful misrepresentation to be one of the differential diagnoses in the examinees that we see for the AOE COE determination. So let's talk about some of the common presentations that you can anticipate to see in your very next examinee. So according to references in the AMA guides, as many as possibly 50% of people feel that purposeful misrepresentation of compensation claims is okay. But then on the other hand, the AMA guides tell us that outright malingering probably is quite rare or is uncommon, is what the AMA guides, how the AMA guides refer to it. Well, I want to share with you probably some more common manifestations of purposeful misrepresentation that the claims administrator may be concerned with that causes him or her to deny these claims in the first place. And what I want to share with you today comes from a book from Rogers entitled Clinical Assessment of Malingering and Deception, 3rd edition, and that is this book right here, Clinical Assessment of Malingering and Deception, 3rd edition, by psychologist Richard Rogers, who is probably the foremost authority in the assessment of malingering in the clinical setting. And as I said, this is the 3rd edition of his book. So in his book, he talks about the difference between malingering, partial malingering, and false imputation. And what I want to share with you today probably has more to do with the examinees that you're going to see in the workers' compensation system than does pure malingering. So let's define some terms. So malingering, and you can think of these purposeful misrepresentations as falling upon a spectrum, with malingering all the way at the far end of the spectrum. Malingering is the conscious or intentional production of false or grossly exaggerated physical symptoms. So they're either false symptoms, meaning the claimant, the injured employee, the alleged injured employee does not even have these symptoms at all. They're false reported symptoms. They're reports of false symptoms. Or they could possibly be grossly exaggerated symptoms. And these are, the report of false symptoms is motivated by external incentives, such as avoiding work, such as obtaining financial compensation, such as avoiding criminal prosecution, such as avoiding military duty, or such as obtaining drugs. So there's an external incentive, that motivates this person to report false or grossly exaggerated symptoms. I want you to notice how many of these external incentives are already present in the workers' compensation system, such as avoiding work, such as avoiding financial compensation, and such as possibly obtaining drugs. So many of these incentives are already present in the workers' compensation system, and this is a concern for the claims administrator. Now, probably more common than outright malingering is partial malingering. Now, with partial malingering, the individual has actual symptoms. They have symptoms, but they consciously and grossly over-exaggerate those symptoms. So the difference between malingering and partial malingering is the presence or absence of bona fide symptoms. Bona fide symptoms. So let me ask you, of these two populations of claimants, which of these two populations of claimants has the greater potential for providing convincing testimony during the face-to-face interview, or even on a telephone interview with the claims administrator? It's the person partial malingering that has actual bona fide symptoms. So this is the type of person who can testify convincingly and truthfully about the character and nature of their symptoms, about the way that their symptoms interfere with activities of daily living. And the reason they can testify truthfully and credibly is because they actually have experience with these symptoms. These are bona fide symptoms. Now, with false imputation, and you're going to see this all the time in California workers' compensation, false imputation, like partial malingering, the examinee has bona fide symptoms or a bona fide medical condition, but they attribute these symptoms to an alternative cause. In this case, such as an industrial injury. So again, with false imputation, the symptoms are real, but it's the cause of the symptoms that is in question, and it's the cause of the symptoms, the cause of the injury, AOE, COE, that brings these people to us for a determination from us as the qualified medical evaluator. So let me just read a couple of examples of what Rogers describes as false imputation. Okay? So this is in chapter 3 of his book. And he says, false imputation occurs when an individual attributes symptoms to an etiologically unrelated cause. For example, a male client seeking to be exempted from college math courses might attribute his problems with concentration to a learning disorder rather than to daily substance abuse. So he actually has difficulty concentrating. He's not faking difficulty concentrating. He actually has difficulty concentrating, but he attributes the difficulty concentrating not to its true cause, which is daily substance abuse, but he attributes it to a learning disorder so that he can be exempted from math courses, right? Attributing it, if he truthfully attributed it to daily substance abuse, that would not exempt him from the college courses, correct? Okay? So that's one definition or one example of false imputation. And as another example, Rogers tells us that false imputation is more difficult to identify as malingering because the individual can, from personal experience, accurately describe the symptoms because they actually have the symptoms. The college student actually had difficulty concentrating. Okay, so that's what he has to say about false imputation. So it's my experience that in the California workers' compensation system, much more than malingering and much more than malingering, you're going to see cases of partial malingering and specifically false imputation where the examinee actually has bona fide symptoms. But it's the cause of the symptoms, the cause of the medical condition that we are charged as qualified medical evaluators with determining. And claims administrators know that claimants are likely to have bona fide symptoms. When you have injured claimants alleging industrial injury, and those claimants are 30 years of age, 40 years of age, 50 years of age, 60 years of age, claims administrators acknowledge that these people will have medical conditions, will have bona fide symptoms, but it's the cause of the symptoms, AOE, COE, that is the issue in dispute. Okay? And before we reveal how to resolve this disputed issue with a causation algorithm, let's just review what the 2017 RAND study had to say about the issue of post-employment cumulative trauma claim claimants. Okay? And then finally, I wonder how many of you have this 2017 study from the RAND Corporation entitled Provider Fraud in California Workers' Compensation. Now, this is a study that was published in 2017 by the well-respected RAND Corporation. So taking the credibility of this source into consideration, I assume that we can rely upon the findings of this particular study in helping us arrive at the correct AOE COE determination in these post-employment cumulative trauma claims. So this study is entitled Provider Fraud in California Workers' Compensation. And there's a couple of sections in this report, and let's go to the table of contents. The sections that we're going to be concerned with here is section 4, entitled Bringing Post-Employment Claims Back into the System. Post-employment claims, and we're specifically concerning ourselves in this discussion with the post-employment cumulative trauma claim. So I encourage you to read this entire study. It talks about workers' compensation fraud in general, talks about how the Division of Workers' Compensation is increasingly relying on what they call advanced analytics to help them identify fraud. And specifically for our purposes, this section in Chapter 4 brings you some fabulous considerations and concepts regarding post-employment claims and explains why you're receiving a flood of phone calls for the Labor Code 4060 the Labor Code 4060 compensability evaluation. So I encourage you to read this. But let's just jump very quickly to page 39 and get to the point for the purposes of this evaluation. And they tell us on page 39 that, on page 59, 39 in the document itself, but 59 here in this Adobe Reader. Let's go here. So they go through some discussion about how liens are being filed in these cases, and the reason liens are filed is because the claims administrator denies these claims, right? We've already established that these are the claims that become denied because of suspicions for fraud and malingering. And they tell us that these high dollar liens that are generated in post-employment cumulative trauma claims give rise to the suspicion that certain providers in certain regions the liens that they generate might not accurately reflect services actually rendered and were filed primarily for the purpose of forcing the insurer to settle for what appears to be mere nuisance value, but instead could be a significant source of profit. In other words, there's reason to believe that the frequency and severity of cumulative trauma liens, and this is due to post-employment cumulative trauma claims for industrial injury, are being largely driven by intentionally fraudulent acts rather than genuine instances of appropriate medical treatment for industrially caused cumulative trauma, which was first discovered after the injured worker had separated from his relationship with the employer, the so-called post-employment cumulative trauma claim. So doctors, this explains how and why these cases come to us for the qualified medical evaluation, for the compensability evaluation under Labor Code 4060. So doctors, I hope this helps you. This helps explain why it is that we're getting these cases for the compensability determination under Labor Code 4060. And we're inching our way towards the exact recipe or algorithm that you can use to correctly opine on AOE COE in every single case. And when I say every single case, I'm referring to correctly opine, how you can be correct every single time. The background information you need to understand before you get to the AOE COE determination has to do with how it is that you're getting these cases in the first place. See, we don't get cases for an AOE COE determination that are the accepted cases, the obvious cases, the explicit cases, the bona fide cases. Those aren't the cases that require a compensability determination. It's the cases that have associated red flags that cause the workers' compensation claims administrator to be concerned for fraud, that causes them to bring out the denied stamp. And the claims administrator simply takes a look at the facts of the case surrounding the claim for the allegation of injury, and he or she simply asks him or herself, can the injured worker carry the burden of proof for establishing the industrial injury? And when the answer to that question is no, in a knee-jerk reflexive reaction, just as was described in the 2017 RAND study, the claims administrator has no option but to deny the claim. Okay? So that's what causes our phone to ring, and we've used the last two sessions to establish the facts that take place behind the scene that have led up to your phone ringing for the appointment request. Now in our next session, we're going to start to bring this all together, and we're going to transition from behind the scenes to the face-to-face evaluation, and we're going to talk about what tools you have available to you in your interviewing techniques with the examinee to assess the examinee's credibility, because the examinee's credibility is going to contribute in large part to your determination either for or against industrial injury. And we'll talk about some tools that you can rely upon to help you quickly and accurately determine whether an industrial injury actually occurred or whether it did not actually occur. And we'll talk about the difference between AOE COE, and we'll put it together in a step-by-step sequence that you can use just like a recipe for making chocolate chip cookies. You can use this recipe in every AOE COE decision-making process so that you don't have to defer the decision, so that you don't have to delay the decision, and so that you don't have to seek shortcuts in arriving at a substantial opinion on AOE and COE. So doctors, I hope this helped you, and I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's discussion. I look forward to being with you on our next discussion, as well as we continue our new series entitled Complex Medical Decision Making and the QME. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter, wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.